I have two individuals joining me to discuss this on Skype. From London is a journalist, Amina Taylor, and from our Abuja studio is a public affairs analyst, Olaliko Oshinkoyi. And now, let me start with you, Amina Taylor. Many thanks to both of you for joining us on this hour, but let me start with you, Amina. What do you make of the decision by Prime Minister Boris Johnson not to publish this report until, after the election next month?
Well, much like Hillary Clinton there, it is one that is dumbfounding, because essentially this means that the government knows whatever is contained within this dossier will not be perhaps positive for the Conservative Party. We've heard stories in the past of very close associations between members of the Tory ruling cabinets and oligarchs, of financiers, of people very high up in the Kremlin. Now, that in of itself wouldn't be problematic because you're allowed to associate freely with whomever you choose. But if it were purely innocent, then of course Boris Johnson would have gone ahead and had this published. So I think one can only infer that the contents of this dossier would not be perhaps something that Tories would want Labour and other opposition parties using as a beating stick against them in the run-up to what is proving to be a tighter than expected election.
All right, Olaleko, let's also get your reaction to the decision by the Prime Minister not to publish this report.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I believe that decision by Boris Johnson is a very political one. It would have been very useful if the electorate of the British public are able to see the nature of interference or the type of interference that happened during the previous election. Releasing that report prior to the elections will have informed the public on the type of interference that could have happened in the past and what could be done. But obviously, doing this will also shift public perception, and it will have political implications. And I think that's probably why the Prime Minister is making that political decision not to release the report until the election cycle that is just around the corner is completed. And I think it's not really helpful, because it will have been more useful for the sake of preservation of democracy to see the nature of the interference, to see what has happened in the past, and then electorate are more empowered to make their decision as they head to the poll, to know what they need to know, what they need to believe, especially now that a lot of campaigning is going on and digital platforms have been attacked left, right, and center, and there has been an indication on that. So it's important for the public to have the information before they go to the poll, not after. Also,
allow me to butt in here, please. When you look at the fact that this report, the Prime Minister has said he's not going to release it until after next month's election, but the report includes allegations of espionage, of subversion, and interference in the election. Now, what's the implication of these for Britain's election, whether he decides to publish or not to publish the report?
I will say that if you look at how the election report.
Olaleko, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I was saying that if you look at the way the decision has been made whether or not to publish the election report and the content of the potential questions in this report, you will realize that it's very important that the public perception stays the way it is now. And that's why I said earlier that it's a political decision. But it will not be helpful for the electorate to not understand what has happened or what's currently happening now, for them to be able to participate fully in the election result or in the election process. So because there has been interference, and I mean, I would believe that the government will have done something to kind of block or to kind of control the level of damage that could have been done by the Russian interference. But barely, we don't know that. We cannot say the extent at which that favors the current government. So if it does favor the current government, maybe it just makes sense to let it. So, but one thing that is very certain is that this is purely a political decision.
All right, let's go to Amina now. When you look at the fact that in the U.S. election, even after the release of the Robert Mueller's report, Trump still has a strong cult following. Do you think that this report, whether released or not, will affect the conservatives, when it comes to matters of election?
Well, I think it's clear why the Conservatives decided to sit on this until after the 12th. And then, of course, there is the case of whether we'll ever really know what's in it after the die has been cast. But in terms of your question about, well, are the systems comparable? I think British politics is a little bit more fragmented than the American system, where it's distinctly a two-party scenario. Here we have the Scottish nationalists who can wade in, the Democratic Unionists who can wade in, the Liberal Democrats and so on in the British system. So people might have voted with their feet when they've heard the news and when they've had an opportunity to digest it. I think what the real tragedy here is, we don't know. It's speculation. It could even be for the Conservatives. If you were Dominic Cummings, the man who is the de facto chief of staff at number 10 there, I would have released it and then given our account of what is necessary and what is perhaps pertinent. Because the more there is speculation about what is in this dossier that's not being released, that then becomes something that might be bigger than the story that's contained within. But one must also cast their minds back to the Leave campaign during the referendum and the proof after that, that there was actually interference from outside sources in trying to direct how people voted in that referendum. So maybe the problem within this dossier are so huge that the Conservatives will prefer that we speculate than give us the facts and let the electorate vote how they see it.
All right, Amina, the government's ministers have said that, look, there is no report of any successful interference in election or even the referendum. Or even the referendum. But the National Security Advisor, McGuinness, has said that there is still a lot of vulnerabilities that Russians can exploit. Do you think that enough is being done ahead of December's election to ensure that there are no vulnerabilities that any country at all can exploit?
No, I'm afraid it's a little bit too late in the day for those assertions, because what we've seen from the high-level nature of what happened in the United States is that no country is immune from this. And whether they're state actors or internal actors who want to actually meddle with the way the system is supposed to work, those individuals and entities are already a step ahead. So anything at the moment is fighting fires. They're not actually preventing those breaches in the system. So I'm afraid right now, the government, the opposition, all those who are interested in ensuring that fair play persists, we're playing catch up. That's what's happening here. We're not actually fixing the problem. We're putting plaster over where we think the issues are and crossing our fingers and hoping for the best, because this has only come about in the last few years or so. Interference used to be a much bigger entity where much more resources were needed to actually make a real change. Now you just need a really good social media account and the right number of bots to be able to really do something that's a little bit more subversive, I'm afraid.
All right. I'm going to Olaliko. When the Labour Party right now is already complaining about high level of cyber attacks on its platforms, what can the UK government do at this moment? What kind of reforms can they put in place to ensure that this level of cyber attacks are minimized ahead of the election?
One of the quick things that could have happened, because there is the idea that there is no interference or there are no vulnerabilities. I think personally that is not true. That there will always be vulnerability, there will always be the potential attack loopholes. And I think if you look at what the Labour leader, Corbyn, was saying recently, that they are already even noticing some of these attacks themselves on different platforms. And I think the government who come in at this point and quickly try as much as possible to close most of these vulnerabilities as much as they can. Although, I mean, the election is just going to be in a few weeks, I mean, there's only much that can be done within a short time. But I think also this is not a new thing. There had been talked about this from 2017 election cycle. So by now, whatever gap that could have been closed before now should have been closed. And I think it's about using all the resources that, actually this is a special election. It's very important that this election is not manipulated. And then the integrity of this election has to be absolute. And for that reason, the government must put every resources at its disposal, use all the security apparatus to make sure that all the vulnerabilities are limited to the minimum level possible. because if the integrity of this election is not absolute, it will affect a lot of things around the democracy in the UK moving forward, because there's a lot at stake at this time for this election.
All right. Public Affairs Analyst Olaliko Osunkoyi and journalist Amina Taylor, many thanks to both of you for sharing your thoughts with us on this issue.